I mentioned in my previous entry that whereas Matthew's wife Abby would use the usual technique in writing fiction, which is to say she would draw from real life, Matthew would actually write autobiography in a sense, and then obfuscate it a little bit so you couldn't tell that it was him and you couldn't identify the people in it. But basically it was his life story. So Matthew's writing, as I realized intuitively when I first set my eyes on it years and years ago, is really veiled autobiography or coded autobiography, and there's a great deal of him in it. So we're going to return to a character named K.N. Pepper, and I'm going to read one of those poems, and then I'm going to go back and we'll dig into it a little bit, and I'll show you where I think he's writing about himself. There's a couple little interesting clues. This is how I learned about Matthew's personal life, because once I learned to read his code, I could see where he was telling us actually about his life and his relationship with Abby and his hopes and dreams and fears and so on. So I've already explained this K.N. Pepper character, but in 1855, Matthew was writing this character. It was supposedly someone named P. Pepper Pod who was sending in the poetry by his rustic friend, K.N. Pepper, meaning cayenne pepper. And cayenne pepper is rather an ignorant country fellow, but it was all just kind of a goof, really. You know, Matthew played all the parts, so he would write in as P. Pepper Pod, and then he would send in poetry by his friend K.N. Pepper and give updates about K.N. Pepper's life and so on. And they sort of created this thing out of nothing, basically. And it's a parody of people who thought that they were great poets. Now, whether it's a parody of any person in particular or not, I don't know. But in writing that parody, Matthew was actually writing about himself in all seriousness. So it runs absolutely on two different levels. And it's the deeper level here that we're going to be looking at today, where he's really writing about himself. So what I have here, I have all the original volumes of this series of poetry. This is volume 45, the first half, of 1855. We're going to look at the June 1855 edition. And I'll put it up on the screen. This is very small type. I'm going to bring my light down, as I sometimes do when it's really, really small. And I think I've got it up high enough. And let's see if I can read this. Oh my gosh, it's so small. It's like 6-point type. And I don't know why they did that. This is not in the main body of the edition. This is in what's called the editor's table, where there's just scraps and bits and pieces that the editor found interesting. This is the Knickerbocker, so he made it into the Knickerbocker proper. But here it's just in the editor's table. And I think I can read it. Now, all of this is in deliberate misspelling, like phonetic misspelling. But this is Matthew's old style, going back to when he was a boy of 12 years old in 1825. He launched this genre in America with a character called Joe Strickland when he ran away from home. Joe Strickland was a runaway, and so was Matthew. So that's the way he writes autobiography. So he started that style, and he's picking it up here in verse. And the words are horribly misspelled, and they're malapropisms. They're deliberately misspelled so as to sound awful or look awful or be comical or to mean something else, you know, like Freudian slips throughout the whole thing. So I will have to sort of read it straight, and you will have to interpret as you see it on the screen. Behold the moon diminish into nothing. At once he's checked, his bright career cut off. Once he was rejoicing as he was able to afford such a good article of light, he being small and not yet got his growth. But the praises as was lavish unto him had the effect to unsettle his mind. He thought of his rivals as was jealous and was afraid he'd get hurt, or what's worse, to a sensitive luminary, squenched. His worst fears, alas, are sadly realized. Although he would shine, yet we see he can't. In consequence, of a peculiar arrangement, all of his efforts don't do no good. Why did earth step in so furious and elbow off the track the sweet moon as had delighted thousands? Why? Did I say why? I said why. Evidently because he was a burning too much ile. He was exerting of himself in an unnatural manner. Could he expect to shine so allers? Didn't earth know it? Does earth know anything? Has he administered a check onto the occasion? Why did the clouds come up and complete the scene? Why? Because all nature sympathize. They regulates each other. When one goes it too fast for his health, they all reason with him, first mild, and if that don't do no good, then rather stronger, as we see. It's supposed that 2 or 3 such corrections in a year is all as keeps him from making a fool of hisself. But my muse, she is a-leaving. She's afeared to trust her pepper since the great poem. I spect it was rather hard onto her, judging from my own melancholy situation, which is bad. Alas, like unfortunate moon, the poet was too careless in the use of his isle. His fireworks was fine, but too expensive. So nature steps in, knocks genus concave, and he is presently an aggravated human eclipse of the worst kind. Such is the misfortunes of genus. So that's called the eclipse, and there was an eclipse apparently at that time. So Matthew, as K.N. Pepper, compares the eclipse of the moon to the eclipse of a genius. See? Well, he knows he is a genius. I don't care, how immodest that sounds to you. I demonstrated last time that he mentioned several times in character, seemingly joking around, that he knew he was a genius from childhood. Well, he was. So this thing, if you read it straight through instead of the halting way that I've done, to me it's hilarious. I can't speak for anybody else, but I know his mind. I have his same higher mind. I have his same emotional makeup, and it's a scream. I mean, I'm laughing at my own past life stuff, but it's hilarious to me. But there's a great deal in this. So let's go through it a little bit. So he says, this is talking about his youth when Matthew was like 18 or so and editing the Constellation probably. Once he was rejoicing as he was able to afford such a good article of light, meaning light, in this case symbolically meaning talent and intellect and wisdom. He being small and not yet got his growth. So he means when he was in his late teens. And I have felt this for a long time, that Matthew, as I've said, felt like he had the world by the tail when he was 18 and editing a New York newspaper. But the praises, as was lavish unto him, had the effect to unsettle his mind. So apparently it went to his head to some extent. And then he says, he thought of his rivals as was jealous and was afraid he'd get hurt, or what's worse, to a sensitive luminary, squenched. So apparently Matthew, I don't know what period he's talking about, but I've gathered that he had death threats, and it may have been fairly early on. So he made some people jealous as an 18-year-old writing really extremely advanced work, even though he did it anonymously, signing D and not signing it all in the New York Constellation and signing with a star and so on. There are people that knew. And I do think that when he wrote for the New England Galaxy, when he was even younger, that Joseph T. Buckingham, the editor, had a son, Edwin, who was a little bit older. And I felt and I gather that Edwin was very jealous, partly because Joseph T. Buckingham kind of adopted Matthew, took him under his wing and mentored him. And he was actually, Matthew was smarter, smarter than most of them and a better writer than Edwin. And Edwin knew it. And I think he got jealous. Now, whether Matthew's talking about that or something that happened in New York, or whether he's talking later on, I'm not sure. I don't know what period he's referring to. He may be referring to several periods at once. And then he says that what happened was he was too intense, burning too much ile, meaning oil. He was exerting of himself in an unnatural manner. Now, first of all, unnatural instead of unnatural, that's Ethan Spike talk. His main character that he's known for, Ethan Spike, that's a peculiarity of Ethan Spike. So he's basically writing Ethan Spike in verse here. It's clearly Mathew Franklin Whittier. But what he says is that he was pushing too hard, staying up too late, and pushed himself too hard, and he had a physical reaction to that. Well, I have the same problem. I push myself the same way, and I have to moderate my intensity the same way. And last night when I was thinking about doing this entry, what occurred to me was that I'm a follower of Mayor Baba. There's a spiritual center in North Myrtle Beach where I used to live. And it used to be in the old days, you could meet some of Mayor Baba's original disciples at that center who were staying there, for a retreat. And one of them that ended up moving there, I got to know fairly well, was Adele Walken. Well, I was cooking something in the kitchen there, and I had the gas cranked all the way up to try to get this, thing heated up, whatever it was. And she just casually said, the hottest point is down a little bit. I think it was the blue flame or something. She showed me if you turn it down a little bit, that's actually the most efficient flame to use. And that was it. She didn't say anything more, and she didn't know me that well. But this is the kind of thing that still happens at the Mayor Spiritual Center and used to happen, is that when you needed some instruction, it would just happen very, very naturally, very interesting. So I understood immediately what that was about. That wasn't about cooking, but this goes back, to a past life, and we have evidence now. I mean, you can draw these objective parallels between Matthew's life and my life. I can't say I've learned this lesson. I'm working on it. And then he says, could he expect to shine so allers? Didn't Earth know it? Does Earth know anything? So, he's being silly, but the question is Earth Gaia? Is Earth a conscious being or not? That's the question he's asking. He says, why did the clouds come up and complete the scene? Why? Because all nature sympathize. They regulate each other. Now he's talking about something very deep that Abby taught him on the esoteric line of things. And that is that nature is conscious and responds to man, see? So not only your physical body and your physical health and the mind-body connection, but also nature out there responds to man and regulate each other. See, so you would never think that this idiot, K.N. Pepper, is actually speaking high mysticism, but that's what's going on here because there's a genius behind the idiot, you see? And there's a genius behind the genius because Abby was Matthew's teacher in these matters, all of them. And Abby was the driving force behind A Christmas Carol, not Charles Dickens. So what we're seeing is Abby's pupil here, putting out some of the ideas that Abby taught him, but under the cover of humor. He says that 2 or 3 such corrections a year is all as keeps him from making a fool of himself. So, in other words, he realizes that he pushes too fast and he gets a big head and he needs to be brought down a peg a couple times per year, and it keeps him regulated. And then he talks about his muse. K.N. Pepper's always talking about his muse, but Matthew really did talk about his muse, and Abby had passed on, 14 years earlier. So I think he's possibly talking about Abby inspiring him from the other side, as she does for me today. And he talks about his situation being bad. Well, he's fallen in love with a girl whose father is preventing him from being with her. That's exactly like what happened with Matthew and Abby. So I think he's created this situation for this character that reflects his relationship with Abby back in the day. And so here he says, the poet, meaning the poet, was too careless in the use of his ile. His fireworks was fine, but too expensive. See? So he's again talking about pushing too fast, too hard. So nature steps in, knocks genius concave, and he is presently an aggravated human eclipse of the worst kind. Such is the misfortunes of genius. So he's writing this horrible caricature of a genius, but he is the genius behind it. And he realizes that he pushes too hard. And there's other little clues in here. So that's all I wanted to share, just this little bit about Cayenne Pepper and illustrating how Mathew would write about himself in character as one of these ignoramuses.